back to town. Luckily, it's nobody parked next to the beast. Still gotta check it for door dings though. Just never know. Looks good. Ooh. My favorite part, cold start. Let's get out of here. Sounds so good in the parking garage. Nice. What's going on, everybody? Back in the beautiful Greenville, South Carolina. Finally. Thanks for joining me. As always, if you're new to the channel, I appreciate you stopping in as well. Hit the subscribe button right now because just do it. We just continue growing the channel, and I'd love for you to tag along through this journey so we can all work together to continue to develop this community and this culture we love around speed. Speed Culture Studios, get it? So I get a number of questions through Facebook and Instagram on a daily basis about different things, and I love it. I enjoy it a lot, and I love helping people as much as I possibly can, because ultimately that's what this channel is all about. So I've narrowed in on a few, 5 to be exact. I'm going to start with the maybe less frequent to the most common question. So let's get going. The first, number 5. There's a couple of questions, but I combined them just to keep it simple. That question is it worth getting cams and headers? My answer is no and no. First reason why, quite expensive, quite labor intensive for both actually, cams especially, but headers are not easy to install in these cars. And you just don't get a whole lot of additional power. Now you will increase power, especially if you combine the two. If you do cams and headers, you're going to be, bringing in more and getting rid of more. So the two working in unison will have an impact. But again, when you consider cost and labor and downtime, and you think about what you get out of the modification, I would say it's not worth it. Unless you're all about keeping the car NA, as making naturally aspirated, and getting as much power and torque out of it as you possibly can, and you don't really care how long it takes or how hard it is to do or how much it costs, go for it. I think there is a 370Z out there that's got all of this done, including cams, and may even be on E85. Not quite sure, don't quote me on that. And thinking back, I want to say around 390 horsepower to the wheels and over 300 foot-pounds of torque. Pretty solid numbers. Again, don't quote me on these numbers, but if I'm thinking back and my memory serves, which probably doesn't, I think those were the numbers or thereabouts. Number 4, again, as it pertains to the VQ37, the question is supercharger or turbo, and should I, or is it worth it? I think this branches off the last question really, really well. If you're going to put a bunch of money and effort into it anyway, then going forced induction is worth it. It's going to be a much, much bigger bang for your buck compared to doing all these different bolt-ons, cams, headers, all the effort and the money involved in that kind of stuff. You might as well toss it in toward a forced induction setup and really make some good numbers. Now, which one do you choose? That's the question. I guess you really have to consider what you're going to use the car for and what suits your needs. Now, turbocharger creates much more efficient horsepower because it's using the car's exhaust basically to spin the turbo and create more pressure into the engine, force more air into the engine, creating more horsepower. Whereas a supercharger is belt driven, so it's using your engine to turn the supercharger pulley, which then forces the air into the engine and creates more power. So essentially it's creating more drag on the engine itself, so it's not as efficient in making power. However, everyone knows that with a turbo setup, there's sometimes a little bit of a lag. You obviously have to build boost, so you don't get that turbo jolt right away, whereas a supercharger, the horsepower is instant. So for someone like me who's considering autocross, where I want the power to be on tap and not necessarily, wanting to deal with any lags in power output, supercharger might be the way to go. Another thing to consider is the setup itself. How easy is it, and how cost effective is it? I don't think there are very many options in terms of superchargers out there. Obviously, Stillen's the biggest name, but it's basically a bolt-on setup, retune situation. Whereas the turbo, do you want to go single turbo, rear mount? Do you want to try to find some space in the engine bay? Do you want to go underneath the car? You're going to have to find the right setup that works for you, and you're kind of limited by space and plumbing and all sorts of things, and it may end up costing you more than the supercharger kit anyway. So just some things to consider. Again, if you got the money, you're planning on spending a bunch of money on bolt-ons anyway, go forced induction with the 3.7. You're going to make some really nice numbers, and then you can truly compare apples to apples with those 3.0T guys. Everybody likes to talk a big game, but they're talking about a forced induction car versus an NA car. What do you expect? Number 3, you're in the market for a 2014, 2015 Q50, obviously the VQ37. Should I go sport package or premium or base model? Great question, guys, great question. For me, I actually sought out the base model intentionally, and I'll give you a couple reasons why. Number 1 is price. I knew I could find a better deal on a base model. Don't really care about the sport bumper that much. I knew I could find a deal on paddle shifters. I knew I could find a deal on the upgraded brake system. I do like the sport seats, but I was willing to sacrifice. Never use navigation. Don't give a crap about it. But what I knew I didn't want is drive-by-wire nonsense. I want to feel the road, right, in the steering wheel. And I was a little bit iffy about the suspension setup that comes in the sport and maybe the premium. But I just wanted to know that there's nothing weird that I had to deal with when I was making these upgrades and changes. So my suggestion is, if you want everything done for you and you love that front sport bumper and you can't live without leather seats, go for that sport. Otherwise, if you're like me, you want to find a deal and you can make the car as close to the sport model as you want it to be without getting some of the things that you don't want anyway, go for the base. I love getting mail. Oh boy. Love it. Thank you, Vinyl Sickness. Get these on immediately, if not sooner. Not all about having stickers on the car, but you got to promote the brand, promote the channel, right? Looks pretty good. Don't forget the Instagram. Continuing on, number 2. And this one has been a big one lately. I assume it's because summertime is here. People are considering going lower. So the question is, obviously, springs or coilovers? I've talked about this before, but here's a quick summary. Just like anything else, you have to consider what you're going for and consider what your budget is. So there's a lot of benefits to coilovers. Adjustability is one, and I would say durability as well. But you can really dial in that stance and performance in terms of stiffness and, again, ride height and things like that. So really changing up the suspension geometry for your car and really dial in that performance. So coilovers are a really good option, especially if you're going to be tracking the car often, or if you're just one of those people that really wants to have a custom stance. You just have to remember that coilovers are quite a bit more expensive than lowering springs. I've used lowering springs a lot over the years, and it's a good option as well. And really, it's a fraction of the price of coilovers, but the one thing you do have to consider is that you're taking out the suspension components anyway, and you're going to have to take the springs off of the shocks and struts and then replace those lowering springs. So it's actually a lot more work in terms of installation, but again, a fraction of the price. I'm right now running Tane S-Tech springs. They're under $300 for the set. It took maybe 3 or 4 hours to install, and it was the first time installing them on this car. If I did it now, I could probably get it done in just about 2 hours. However, with lowering springs, obviously you're limited to the ride height that the springs will allow. There's no adjustability. The springs really have been awesome in this car, really lowered, like obviously, lowered the center of gravity in the car, but body roll has essentially been eliminated, which I'm very, very happy with. The Tane S-Techs have about a 1 1/4, just under 1.5 inch drop, so it's a nice medium between the RSR downs that are very common and the super downs that are quite low, but pretty popular. It's a good position to be because there's no really, I mean, alignment is important, but there's no issues with camber being way out. It's not super low, so I'm not super worried about shocks blowing out, but that is another concern. The one thing I will say though is that most people driving these cars will never ever need or push the car hard enough to justify coilovers. Coilovers truly are a performance part, and to really get the most out of them, the car needs to be pushed really, really hard. And like I said, 90, 95, 99% of the people that are running coilovers never actually race the car hard enough to justify needing them. The stock suspension will get them what they want, but really what they're mostly going for is the looks, obviously. And if you have the $1,000, $1,500, $2,000 to spend on coilovers, go for it. So the long and the short of it is, the question, springs or coilovers, again, the answer is, what are you going for? Are you tracking the car a lot, pushing the car really hard, then go for coilovers. It makes sense. Also, if you're one of those people that really wants the perfect stance in your opinion, and you want to be able to have all sorts of adjustability, again, go with coilovers. If you're just looking for a simple drop to eliminate some of that wheel gap, and want to lower the center of gravity a little bit so you can, carve some corners on the weekends, and just do a little bit of spirited driving, springs is the way to go. You can, again, fraction of the price. And numero uno, the biggest, most common question that I get is, what cold air intake should I get? Believe it or not, my answer to this question is always the same. Don't bother. Don't bother wasting your money on a cold air intake for these VQ37s. Just get some drop-in filters. K&N makes an oiled filter, otherwise AEM makes a dry filter that'll fit these cars that I'm actually going to be trying out before we retune, so we'll really see if it makes a difference. But for just $100, you can get a couple drop-in filters. If you want to spend another $100, you can get some of the Z1 intake tubes, which will clean up the engine bay. And for just, filters alone, the intake tubes are not going to do anything for performance. So for $100, technically, you can get basically the same amount of performance that you're going to get out of the cold air intake. It's been proven over and over and over, and you can look at all of the dyno videos online and see this for yourself. Just compare the modifications, and the cars with the cold air intakes compared to the cars with just drop-in filters made the same amount of power. Maybe on occasion you can find 1 to 2 additional horsepower, but again, horsepower numbers vary from dyno to dyno, so those really aren't even reliable. So really there's just no evidence, not enough evidence in my opinion anyway, to justify the purchasing and installation of a $300, $400, $500 cold air intake system when drop-in filters are going to get you the same amount of power. The fact is that the intake system from the factory is actually pretty decent, kind of acts like a ram air system. If you look in there, it goes underneath that little front cowl trim piece, and the air is directed right into the intake boxes. So just getting a little bit better flowing filter is going to make all the difference in the world. The Z1 intake tubes, some people can argue that it eliminates turbulence in the intake air, and maybe some will say that silicone is a little better insulator than the rubber that the stock tubes are made out of, so it keeps the intake air a little bit cooler, and that could be, but I don't think it's going to be anything that you can notice in terms of performance. The filter really is the big part. So there you go. That's my answer to that one. Cold air intake, nonsense. Don't worry about spending $400 or $500 on one. If you like how they look and you want to, go for it. But if you're really thinking about performance and dollar to horsepower ratio, it's just not necessary. Drop-in filters is the way to go, and I'm sticking to that story. A couple of runner-up questions: is the big brake kit worth it? Just did a video dedicated to that recently. Go ahead and take a look at it and you'll get my answer there. Another is, what exhaust system is best for the cars? What should I do? Muffler, delete, all of that stuff. I've done a ton of videos on those, so I'm not going to really take any more of your time. My current setup is beautiful in terms of how it sounds, in my opinion, obviously, but take a look at some of those videos. relatively recent ones as well, so you can hear it for yourself. Keep the questions coming, everybody. Really enjoy it. I like knowing what people are working on and dealing with right now, and I'll love to help you out as best I can. I appreciate all the support, appreciate all the thumbs up and the subscribers, and all of you that have been following along, the new ones from the ones that have been around for the last year or so. Appreciate the support very, very much. Look forward to seeing you in the next video. If you have any questions or comments, again, leave them in the comment section below. I get back to every single one of them. So thanks again. See you in the next one.